there's an expression that I've said on this podcast many times, but I'll say it again, is that hard times create hard men. Hard men create soft times. Soft times create soft men. Soft men create hard times.
At some point on your voyage through the internet, you've probably heard this quote be recited by some bald and or bearded muscle man on a podcast as he decries the fall of masculinity in America. They often cite this quote as a known universal truth about the world, but I rarely see anyone delving deeper into its source or the meaning behind it. So let's dig a little deeper, right now, in this video that you're watching. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Many of those who use this quote will cite it as coming from a book authored by someone named G. Michael Hopf. And as a quick Google search will confirm, that is indeed correct. The book is called Those Who Remain, and is the 7th book in his New World series of post-apocalyptic sci-fi novels. Now, maybe it's just me, but I assumed this quote would be traced back to some ancient philosopher or academic type. That's usually the case with these kinds of quotes. You know, like all those images that get shared around with a bust of Marcus Aurelius saying like, "Man up, stop being a pussy," or something like that. But like, this book is from 2016, and G. Michael Hopf is just some guy. I mean, he's a former Marine, he seems to be a fairly successful fiction writer. I'm not trying to downplay his accomplishments, but he's not exactly the person I would go to for an analysis of the socioeconomic state of the world. This guy doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. Now obviously, that in no way discredits this quote in and of itself. People with fancy degrees can be wrong, and people without them can be right. But it's interesting to me how, if a quote gets shared around and people say, "Oh, it's from a book," everyone assumes, well, surely the author must know what he's talking about. I mean, he wrote a book. Anyone can write a book. Anyone. So what did G. Michael Hopf mean by hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times? Well, luckily I don't need to read 7 sci-fi novels to fully understand the context, because he wrote an essay on the quote himself on his website. Ignore the grammatical errors, this guy is a professional writer and knows what he's talking about. So what is a strong man according to Hopf? A strong man is someone who isn't only physically up for the challenge. And yes, physicality plays a role, as one who cares for their body is disciplined and understands their bodies are critical to caring for not only themselves, but their loved ones. A strong man is also virtuous, regimented, focused, driven, and selfless. Their goal is to care for those around them and strive to build a sustainable and value-driven society built upon common beliefs. They are purpose-driven people. Why does he specifically use the word strong here when describing men with these attributes? Other than the aspect of physicality at the beginning, which he himself feels like he needs to justify in his own definition, these men could be better described as virtuous men, or selfless men, or even caring men. But instead of using those better descriptors, he shoehorns in an aspect of physical strength so he can refer to them specifically as strong men. We'll talk a little more about why he uses the word strong later in this video, but for now, what's important is that he uses this framing of strength to create a better juxtaposition for his definition of weak men. So what is a weak man? A weak man is someone who tends to be selfish and even narcissistic. Their only concern is their own pleasure or desires. They are literally the polar opposite of a strong man, and their values are driven by a need for self above all else. They tend to value being entitled to what a wealthy society has provided without ever daring to contribute to it. In fact, a weak man will often complain that the current system has failed them, even though they live in relative comfort. Now we see what Hopf really has a problem with here. The weak men are the ones calling out the failings of the current system, even while living in a nebulously defined relative comfort. He includes aspects of selfishness in his definition that comes off more as his interpretation of why these people are criticizing the current system. He doubles down on this aspect of his definition when he says, "Think of the person who goes to Starbucks and on their iPhone complain about capitalism on Instagram or Facebook. These people have forgotten history and have no knowledge on how their surroundings came to be. In fact, they will declare the system should be dismantled. That declaration leads to an ushering of hard times. Yes, these young kids today just don't understand how their forefathers toiled to bring them the abundances of capitalism, like a $6 cup of coffee and Facebook.
Sweet Baby Ray's barbecue sauce.
This is just the classically dumb argument of, oh, you're critiquing the system you live under, and yet you participate in it. How interesting. Here, Hopf is claiming that the weak men have forgotten history, and that's why they inevitably bring on hard times. So what history does Hopf bring to back up his claim that strong men create good times and weak men create hard times? He writes, in 2015, as I was writing the novel, Those Who Remain, Book 7 in the New World series, #ad, I was also reading a lot about generational theory. It is from my research, specifically the Strauss-Howe generational theory, advanced in their books Generations and The Fourth Turning, that I was inspired to add the quote. So what is the generational theory that Hopf is referring to? I'll try to explain this as quickly as possible. Generational theory is a theory proposed by Neil Howe and William Strauss in 1991. The idea is that history repeats itself in patterns that are defined by the generations living at that time. Let's use a diagram to illustrate it a little better. According to generational theory, history is made up of 80 to 100-year periods of time, called seculum, about as long as one human life. Each seculum is made up of 4 turnings, each roughly 20 years long, about as long as it takes someone to come of age as an adult. A new seculum begins at the end of some kind of crisis, usually a period of war. After that crisis, the first turning begins, a high period of strengthening institutions and weakening individualism. As a new generation is born during this high period, they come of age at the beginning of the second turning, also referred to as an awakening period, where the differing values of the first turning generation and the second turning generation leads to an attack on the civic order established during the first turning. Time marches on and a new generation is born during the second turning and comes of age during the third turning. The third turning is referred to as the unraveling, where individualism strengthens and the old civic order decays. The fourth turning is the beginning of the end of the seculum, also known as the crisis period. During this period, the old civic order is replaced with a new one in response to a time of crisis. As mentioned earlier, this period is usually marked by war and turmoil. Out of this crisis, a new seculum is born, repeating with another first turning high period, and the cycle continues. To better see how all this fits together, let's fill this diagram in with the seculum we are currently living in, according to Strauss and Howe. The most recent crisis that began this seculum is the combination of the Great Depression and World War II during the 30s and 40s. After the war, the greatest generation came home and started buying houses and having babies, resulting in the baby boomer generation, born between 1946 and 1964, followed by Gen X, born between 1965 and 1980, Millennials born between 1981 and 1996, and lastly Gen Z, born between 1997 and 2012. Which, if you're watching this, you most likely fall under. Congratulations, you were born during the worst time in the seculum, according to generational theory. If you're wondering, I fall right between Millennials and Gen Z, which is why I barely have enough of an attention span to make video essays, but also have a sense of humor degraded by constant internet access while my brain was developing. It's worth noting, there's also Gen Alpha born after 2012, but they largely aren't old enough to factor into the current seculum. So, in this diagram, who are the strong men and who are the weak men according to Hopf? Presumably, he would say that these are the strong men, the greatest generation. They were molded by the hard times of the Great Depression, they fought in the largest and most destructive war in human history, and when they came home, America saw arguably the strongest economic resurgence it had ever seen. That certainly seems like hard times creating strong men, and strong men creating good times. Until you look just a little bit deeper. For instance, the economic surge that followed World War II, was that due to the greatest generation being virtuous, regimented, focused, driven, and selfless, as Hopf would claim? I don't think so. Following the war, most of Europe's economic infrastructure was devastated, leaving the US as one of the only economic powers left in the world that was relatively unfazed by the war. So the US had an untouched industrial infrastructure coupled with a new market, as Europe worked to rebuild their own infrastructure. It's much more likely this is why the US prospered economically after the war, not simply because the strong men worked harder. But what about the weak men of this seculum? Well, I imagine Hopf would claim that these are the weak men, the baby boomers. as they are the ones who grew up during the good times of the post-war economic boom. And Hopf is right. They certainly did complain about the system at that time. They complained so hard that they achieved civil rights legislation for Black Americans and women, increasing equality under US law. I don't think I would call that selfish or narcissistic, but maybe Hopf would disagree, I don't know. They did make a lot of great music though, a claim I think Hopf would agree with considering he quotes one of the most legendary songwriters of that era at the end of his essay. Ironically, Bob Dylan exemplifies everything Hopf is criticizing here. Dylan grew up during the good times of the post-war economic boom, and then, in his 20s, went on to be very vocal in criticizing the system he lived under, writing songs denouncing segregation, war, etc. Bob Dylan is exactly the weak man that Hopf describes. Except, most people today look back on the work that Dylan and the civil rights movement did as a good thing, that made times better, not harder. But I'm not surprised that Hopf doesn't see this obvious contradiction when he quotes Dylan, because I think largely his arguments and his quote isn't based in history. Hopf is actually correct that most generations who grew up during good times do go on to criticize the systems that they grew up under, but he is wrong when he claims this leads to an ushering of hard times. And baby boomers aren't the only example of this being false. Many second-turning generations spearheaded reforms that objectively made times better. For example, the Lost Generation, born between 1983 and 1900, grew up during the good times of the Gilded Age, and went on to promote women's suffrage, antitrust legislation, and form unions, which, by the way, helped guarantee that those strong men of the greatest generation actually had decent paying wages when they came home from World War II. My point in all of this is that Hopf claims that his view of strong men and weak men is based in an understanding of generational theory, but I would say it's more accurate to say it's based on a bastardization of that theory. Generational theory is interesting, I think it's worth study and discussion, but I think it's overall an oversimplified view of history, which is complex and multifaceted. Hopf's quote is a simplification of that simplification, and loses any historical relevance in the process. If Hopf looked back at history at all before writing this in his book, he probably would have seen that. But it seems like Hopf doesn't actually care about history. What he cares about is pushing an agenda. As I alluded to earlier in the video, let's talk about why Hopf specifically chooses the words strong and weak in his quote. Hopf's views on the world are pretty obvious after reading his essay, and even more obvious after reading a few of his tweets. Hopf is pro-capitalism and pro-traditional gender roles. Now, I'm not here in this video to critique his political beliefs, even though my own beliefs don't align with his, but I am going to claim that this quote and the framing he presents in his essay is nothing more than propaganda to elevate his own personal views. Hopf doesn't like the political left in America because they critique capitalism and traditional views of gender. So he wants to paint anyone who critiques those things, the status quo, as weak, and promote his side as strong, as strength evokes the ideas of traditional masculinity that he supports. If he instead referred to them as selfless men or caring men, which better fit the definition he gives, that wouldn't bring to mind the traditional gender roles that he supports, as you could easily argue that a selfless man or caring man wouldn't necessarily support traditional ideas of gender. They would probably support people living in a manner that makes them happiest, assuming it doesn't hurt anyone else. Or even worse, a selfless man or caring man may support social programs that help people survive the hardships of capitalism. Oh no! Hopf's quote is essentially just one of those Chad Wojak memes masquerading as political analysis, even though history doesn't actually back it up, and that's exactly how people on the internet use the quote. They don't care if history backs it up. They have a specific view of the world that they want to promote, and the idea that strong men create good times and weak men create hard times falls perfectly within that view, even if history doesn't support that idea. And hey, it's in a book. It must be smart. Hey, if you made it this far, thanks for watching. This video took me a little longer than I expected since I had to do research into generational theory and all that kind of stuff, but I really enjoyed making it, and I hope you enjoyed watching it. At the very least, I hope you're a little more skeptical of anyone who uses this quote. If you found this video interesting or informative, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. It really helps out the channel and lets me know that I should be making more stuff like this. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.